Welcome. A very, very warm welcome. I see colleagues here, members of the Students' Union, and some of you, of course, new visitors, guests. A very, very warm welcome to the University of Cumbria, particularly to our external visitors. My name is Sandra Jowett, and I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor responsible for academic work at the University and research, and it's my great pleasure to be here today and to see you all here to really enjoy the session that we're about to hear. I stand up at quite a number of these things and have done so during my career, but this is the very first time that I've walked into a lecture theatre to the strains of Van Morrison, and it was fantastic. And obviously we're here to celebrate and learn about the professional achievements of Professor Barry Hymer. But it's also nice to know a little about the man when he's outside of his professional passions, and when I was reading about the things he's doing when he's not doing the vast amount of work and development that we're going to hear about today. I looked through his list and I thought, well, the wild camping, no, not really. The poultry keeping, okay. But the hunting for edible fungi, listening to the strains of Van Morrison, that just sounds like paradise, So we know something about the man as well as the professional. I mean, I love coming to inaugurals in all 4 universities that I've worked in, and delighted to be working at this one. But an inaugural is a real opportunity for us all to touch base with what it is that matters to us so much about working in a university, being a supporter of a university. What is it? And an inaugural is a real opportunity for us all to touch base with those important things. Because there's something here around celebrating the achievements to date of an individual, someone who has been honoured the professorial title. So it's a real celebration of scholarship, research, thinking, someone who's reached that level in their professional development. It's someone who's already made a significant contribution to get there, to be doing the inaugural, who's got that potential to excite and stimulate us in our thinking, but someone who's clearly got great potential for the future, and that's the sort of thing that we'll hear about today. And of course, these are the values and attitudes and behaviours that we value so highly at the University of Cumbria, so it's fantastic that we've had this opportunity. And I'd like to thank Barry for giving us that opportunity, joining us at the University of Cumbria and being here today with this lecture that we're really looking forward to. And of course, I'd also like to thank very much Osiris for their support, and their MD is here today to support us again, who's enabled us to make the appointment and to bring Barry into the university for us to learn and work together. And of course, Osiris have a very strong reputation in the sector for the very high quality professional development and training that they provide for our educators. So really important that we have that partnership with them. So I've always loved inaugurals in a sort of generic sense, but before coming into university management, I spent a long time myself as an educational researcher, a number of organisations including National Foundation for Educational Research. And when I look back over those times as a researcher, I think about the things that really drove me for that time. What was it that excited me about being in that world and what was important to me professionally? And the stuff there about professional striving, professional people wanting to be the very best they can, and research can enable us to do that. There's something about ideas being generated and thought through. There's something about getting to the complexity of the worlds in which we inhabit, whatever our profession. And there's something about those critical links between policy and practice. And of course, the work that Barry has done and continues to do and is going to talk to us about presses all those buttons. So I think it's not just a generic excitement of a professorial appointment. It's the very specific things that really tick all my boxes and certainly work for us very well at the University of Cumbria. And in Barry, we have a highly qualified professional person, a practitioner, a primary and a secondary teacher, an educational psychologist, a trainer, a consultant, and someone who has published extensively in professional and academic press. press and of course in the visual media as well. And who has focused particularly on something really, really important, talent development, and taking a particular approach to all sorts of concepts that matter to us all as educators: intelligence, ability, giftedness. And Barry's worked to find very different ways of looking at those things that matter to us all so much. He's interested in those links between policy and research. He's looked for connections across domains. In his theoretical work, he's drawn upon a range of disciplines: economics, politics, psychology, philosophy, a very grounded approach building on all those disciplines. He's looked to bridge theory and practice and to enable people to develop and inform their own capacity, to create robust accounts of their own practice and to generate new theory. And my goodness, has he been prolific, more than 500 presentations to national and international audiences on all sorts of issues, influencing thousands, literally thousands, of teachers, parents, governors, inspectors, advisors. And the sorts of issues that he's covered in these hundreds of presentations. Igniting passion in children, teachers and leaders. The role of challenge in creating outstanding learning. A matter of mindsets, nurturing a school ethos that embraces challenge, intrinsic motivation and learning-led performance. And it's very clear that Barry is not about quick fixes. There's something in his work, the work so far and the work still to come, about deep learning experiences, about thinking skills and creativity. And today, we're going to, you can see the title of the presentation up there. Barry's going to be talking around scholarship in the field of talent development, working through the lived experiences of individuals, complementing working with laboratory studies and theoretical research, but bringing his very particular slant to this stuff that really excites, intrigues and interests us all so much. And a fascinating approach I see in Barry's work to developing talent in a way that transcends nature and nurture. And I've just touched very briefly on some of the things that we know about Barry, apart from his fantastic taste in music, his incredible contribution to date, and we're all very excited to hear more about it. So I welcome to the floor Barry Hymer.
Thank you very much, Professor Jowett, for the very kind and warm introduction. Would it spoil the show if I revealed that that litany of achievements was written by my mum? That's a half-truth. Thank you very much, I do appreciate that, and very kind of you it is. I was just saying to some good friends before the session that it's quite unusual for me to have spent a fair amount of time actually scripting a presentation. Much of my work is done in dialogue with mostly educators and of those usually teachers. But this has been quite a good discipline for me to actually nail down my thoughts and ideas on paper, and I hope that something of the spirit of the dialogic message also comes through in a scripted address. Can I make some particular thanks in follow-up to Sandra's welcome to everyone here. Everybody who's chosen to give up about an hour or more of their lives, depending on whether or not you wish to have refreshments afterwards as well, to be in this lecture hall today, and I'm deeply grateful for that. I'd especially like to thank those who've travelled some considerable distance to be here today. My cousin Nicholas Hymer from Scarborough on the East Coast, my good friends Jan Hughes and Chris Horton from South Yorkshire, Vivian and Mike Batson, who've travelled all the way from Southampton on the south coast. And if they're looking just a little bit smug today, it's because the Saints are back in the Premier League next year, and just where they deserve to be. So I'm delighted that they're with us today. To Stephen Cox, the director that Sandra has introduced in her introduction, who is the MD of the largest producer of high-quality CPD in the United Kingdom. Other brands are available. They're just not quite as good. And Stephen has travelled from deepest, darkest Lincolnshire to be with us today. And I'm particularly pleased, as the holder of the Osiris Chair in Educational Psychology, to have that title. It could be a lot worse. I've thought of a few possibles which are not too far from reality. I could, for instance, be the Murdoch Chair in Political Discretion at the University of Oxford, or the Saif Gaddafi Chair in Ethics at the LSE. You get the picture, but I'll settle for the Osiris Chair in the Psychology of Education. I'm deeply touched too that my good friends Marie Huxtable and Jack Whitehead have travelled to be here from Bath in the West Country today. It was Marie who introduced me to Jack back in Midsummer 2005 in the well-named Midsummer Norton. There wasn't any murder on the day, but it was an introduction that significantly changed the future direction of my professional life. Jack actually gave me a copy shortly afterwards of the book, in which he first sketched out his unique approach to practitioner research. And in many ways it's an unremarkable inscription, but if you know Jack, and I have confidence that many of you, if not already, will get to know him, I think you'll understand the significance. It simply said this: for Barry, in the hope of many more conversations. Love, Jack. And I invite you, colleagues, friends and family, to have a little reflection on that word conversations, because we will be returning to it shortly. And finally, can I say how delighted I am that the people closest to me in my life, my parents, my wife Elizabeth, and her mum Kathleen, and my younger daughter Miriam are with us today as well. My elder daughter is away at university, but she sent me her good wishes. Thanks a lot, love. I hope we'll bother to go to your graduation. I shall work through my bitterness in my own way. My dad is now 90 years old, and my mum is an undisclosed few years younger than that, but I can tell you how pleased I am that they've stuck around long enough to see their son get a proper job again after a decade as a freelance educator, and I'm really chuffed that they're around today. So thank you to you all. So to the substantial business of this lecture, I'd like to begin with a truth claim. And the truth claim is that all knowledge has a history. For many people here today, especially those educators who, like me, are happy to see themselves as operating within the educational paradigm of social constructivism, this will be a fairly self-evident and non-contestable truth claim. Since we do not identify ourselves as hardline empiricists or as classical or logical positivists, we know that knowledge doesn't exist preformed, complete, awaiting discovery by the first lucky explorer to come its way. It emerges slowly, imperfectly and imprecisely as the fruits of a creative, interactive and dialogic act. Between people and between the ideas communicated between people, orally, via the written word, and via the unspoken dialogues of gesture, tone and expression. Knowledge arises, therefore, as the gift of voiced and unvoiced conversations. I stand today having been given the honour as the Osiris Professor of Psychology and Education at the University of Cumbria, publicly to profess knowledge before an audience of friends, family and peers, a few of whom, like my parents, I've known all my life, most of my adulthood, and others I look forward still to get to know. During this lecture, I intend to share some knowledge that I've constructed during my 30 years as an educator. I hope also to construct new knowledge with you and to invite you to construct your own. In an attempt to live my educational credo, forgive me therefore if I choose from time to time to deviate from the transmission model orthodoxy of these occasions and ask you to take some time to reflect for yourself, to have a short conversation with somebody sitting near you, and perhaps you'll then even be kind enough to share your reflections with all of us, or maybe you choose to hold that to the end of this lecture, or even afterwards over refreshments in the view. For those of you who are teachers, you'll immediately recognise this process as the well-known thinking tool, think, pair, share. Children take to it with great readiness, and often with wonderful and creative outcomes. Adults with our defensive carapaces often masking self-consciousness, doubts and insecurities, commonly much less so. Today, however, we will not be common, we shall recognise our self-consciousnesses and our insecurities and ignore them utterly. There are a number of meanings which are ascribed to the word profess, which is, of course, the root of my new title. To affirm openly, to declare or to claim, to practice or claim knowledge of, as in to profess law or medicine, or to affirm a belief in something, as to profess a faith. It can also be used as a term for taking the vows of a religious order, and in fact I'm comfortable with all of those meanings, even the last, as a novitiate monk in the monastery of Academia. But I'm going to make the particular case today for the relevance in this specific context of yet another meaning for the word, to make a pretense of, to pretend, as in the sentence, despite his complicity in the burglary, he professed ignorance of the crime. Today I will be professing a profound ignorance in the area of talent development, which is, ironically, my particular area of interest and expertise. And my reasons for doing so will be revealed later. But in this lecture, I will make three further claims. The first of these, that talent isn't caught, it's taught. The second, that talent development needs a metaphor which is better adapted to our current understandings and our current knowledge. And the third of these, that talent development is at once lawful and deeply anarchic. So to the first of those, talent is not caught, it's taught. For this knowledge claim, I make no additional claim to originality of scholarship. The evidence exists in others' published research and sometimes in the public domain through the work of skilled popularizers, provocateurs, and social commentators, people such as Malcolm Gladwell, Daniel Coyle, David Schenck, Matthew Syed, Jeff Colvin, and many others. Despite these understandings, which we might conceive of as leading to the recent construction of Talent 2.0, large sections of society and a small but diminishing number of academics, people like Professor Ellen Winner at Boston College and Harvard, still believe in the explanatory and sometimes even the predictive power of rather magical and poorly defined concepts. These have been researched more extensively than almost any other area of psychology, yet they still elude any semblance of scientifically consensual understanding. I'm speaking of such concepts as intelligence and its equally problematic siblings and cousins: ability, aptitude, genius, giftedness, and talent. The etiological explanations for all of which tend to boomerang back to innatist notions around genetic inheritance. Until the latter parts of the 20th century, the circular reasoning that maintained the dominance of these ideas wasn't convincingly preached, but it has been now. I take as emblematic of our earlier conceptualizations of talent development the dualistic phrase nature versus nurture, which has seen extensive service for over a century. Like so many resonant phrases, it has its origins in Shakespeare, Prospero's description of Caliban as a devil, a born devil, on whose nature nurture can never stick. But it was adapted and popularized by the brilliant Victorian polymath Francis Galton, many of whose inventions, creations, ideas, and neologisms are still in use today, and many of which have become discredited in response to new scholarship or historical events. For instance, the concept of eugenics and extreme hereditarianism. To these obsolescences might be added the term nature versus nurture. Most contemporary psychologists believe this is a dated and deeply flawed conceptualization. We can no longer believe in a notion of genes somehow overlaid by environment, G plus E, if you like, in an age when all the evidence is that genes interact with the environment and vice versa from the moment of conception. In other words, it's genes times environment, which is a very different algorithm, and which renders the nature-nurture framework good for its author's time, but not the 21st century. Knowledge grows as something new from an interaction with something else, something greater than the sum of each constituent element. Of course genes matter, but all the weight of gene studies suggests, particularly via twin studies, is that there is, on average, a statistically detectable genetic influence on intelligence in the region of 60%. But the variability is huge. It depends on a multiplicity of factors, which group, when measured, how, and so on. A neat model of genes overlaid by environment doesn't adequately capture the dynamic and complex interplay of both. Both have an influence only in interaction with each other, not independently at all. Whatever figure emerges and from whatever study applies only to groups and to that specific group, not to any one individual within that group. To believe otherwise is to misunderstand how statistics work. In other words, twin studies and the like tell us nothing at all about anyone's individual potential. Hence my lack of serious engagement in this issue as an educator. Since I've made no personal contribution to it, I'm keeping my coverage of the claim that talent is not caught fairly short. But I'll be happy to refer anyone who's interested to recent studies that support the alternative claim that talent grows in response to an auspicious and multifactorial educational climate, rather than emerging either primitively or fully formed as a result of some caught genetic predisposition. For present purposes, I'll confine my substantial evidence base to the work of Anders Ericsson and his co-researchers. It was Ericsson's seminal 1990 research in the Music Academy of West Berlin, as it was then called, that gave us the now well-known term, the 10,000-hour rule. It's an idea which has led many people to believe that Ericsson was somehow showing that all it takes to achieve mastery and associated eminence in a domain is the investment of 10,000 hours of practice, which, by the way, corresponds to roughly 3 hours a day, every day, for 10 years. The particular research that made his name as a researcher from this study was looking at 3 groups of musicians. Clearly all of them more than competent. They got into one of the premier academies in Europe. But the only way they could distinguish between the exceptional musicians, who all the evidence suggested were destined to be first violins and soloists, versus the extremely good musicians, who were destined to probably make it into orchestras at a good level, but probably not be preeminent in their field. And the third group, which I tend to blank out when working with teachers, because it looks like such a downer, really. He makes the point, and I think it's quite a wise one, that maybe these are the most ambitious people of all, those who wish to share their talents and their passion for music with others. But he could find no way of distinguishing them from each other except in one domain. They all began formal lessons at roughly 8 years, 1 month. They all decided to become professional musicians at just under 15 years. They all had, on average, 4 different music teachers in their lives. They all played 2 additional instruments. In addition to the violin, the hours devoted to their craft by the age of 20 was the single distinguishing factor. And the scary thing about this is, rather unusually for research, there were no outliers. In other words, there was not one individual who invested 10,000 hours who wasn't considered exceptional. Nor was there anyone who'd invested 10,000 hours who wasn't considered as good. There were no outliers. And it's that research which has given us this phrase, the 10,000-hour rule. I myself never notched up quite those hours during my adolescence and undergraduate years as an obsessive chess player and schoolwork avoider, but I did notch up quite a few. And my parents' memories of my near disastrous secondary education scholastic record will testify to the truth of that. I had invested enough hours, I would have thought, to make a decent living as a professional chess player in the UK when I emigrated from South Africa in 1983. It took me 6 months of penury and near starvation to realise that I needed to find an alternative route to economic independence. A decade or so later, as a professional educator and an amateur chess player, I won the Cumbrian Chess Championship, a handsome trophy, and £20. It remains the modest pinnacle of my youthful ambitions for world chess domination. In fact, Anders Ericsson was offering no assurances that sustained practice guaranteed eminence. His claim was much more nuanced. The 10,000-hour rule encompasses the notion of deliberate practice. That is, practice that is often least enjoyable, but most effortful and designed to bridge the gap between existing and desired performances. He observes that merely performing the same practice activities repeatedly on a regular daily schedule will not lead to further improvement once a physiological adaptation to the current demand has been achieved. The key attribute of deliberate practice is that individuals seek out new challenges that go beyond their current level of reliable achievement ideally in a safe and optimal learning context that allows immediate feedback and gradual refinement by repetition. Vygotsky, of course, memorably characterized this space as the zone of proximal development. This helps us understand the findings of research, such as that by Grape and others, that professional singers report focusing on improving their singing when singing, whereas amateur singers, like my wonderful wife, report the experience of singing as something akin to self-actualization. I feel most alive when I'm singing, they say, and as an enjoyable release of tension. Contestants on the X Factor, please take note. I will acknowledge to anyone who asks that this taught not caught claim requires us to respond to extreme case outliers who at first glance give the lie to it, the Mozarts, the Einsteins, the Fischers, and the Beckhams. That's David, not Victoria, in case anyone's wondering, of human achievement. And I refer them to the others. Popular images perpetuate popular myths. Mozart, for instance, for all his prodigious skills, which were celebrated as marvellous in his own childhood, can actually be seen as something of a late developer, musically speaking. He was remarkable for his age as a young musician, but he was not thought remarkable in comparison with adult musicians of his time. It took almost 20,000 hours to achieve eminence as a performer, and especially as a composer. If all we had to listen to today were the fruits of his first 18,000 hours of deliberate practice, we wouldn't be choosing to listen to him today. We listen instead to his rich late harvest, and it's those works, and only those works, that reveal the sublime majesty of his developed genius, which makes him second only to Van Morrison in the pantheon of musical achievement. The film Amadeus is a great film, but academically it has a lot to answer for, as does my previous disclosure of my low musical tastes. Could I ask you, at this moment, colleagues, friends and family, just to take a few moments for personal reflection and conversation with someone near you. But if you do have any projectiles that you intend launching, hold those to the end of this session. Take a few moments, if you would, sharing I would invite you, please, if you do have any thoughts or comments or challenges, please hang on to those. You can necessarily make a little note, and we will have some time at the end to hopefully respond to those. But I'd like to address now the second of my claims, this notion that talent development needs a metaphor better adapted to our current understandings. The field of talent development is not short of metaphors. Very many of them are variants of an explicitly horticultural simile. They denote or imply some blossoming of a latent capacity. Talent can germinate or unfurl. It can grow or bloom. It can flower and flourish, but it can also be stunted or blighted or wither when the climatic conditions are too cold or arid. In that case, we ask in surprise, where have all the flowers gone? We also hear the phrase talent will out, as if to take for granted that it was always in. Talent, even in this sense, takes on an implicit botanical metaphor, becoming some sort of Japanese knotweed, vigorously expressing itself in inhospitable places. This metaphor does have some definite appeal, and that's probably why it's prevailed for so long. Indeed, it's proved as prolific and durable as dandelions. Seeds can be seen as repositories of promise, full of locked-in potential, awaiting propitious circumstances, the warmth of a sympathetic teacher, perhaps, or the nurturing circumstances of an enriched and challenging curriculum. Jung himself invoked the metaphor when he observed, the curriculum is so much raw material, but warmth is the vital element for the growing plant and for the soul of the child. So far, so good. But let's dig a little deeper in this rich ground. I will argue that our current knowledge of talent development would suggest that botanical metaphors are at best stretched and at worst downright misleading. We now know, despite superficial appearances to the contrary, that there is no preformed genetic kernel of nascent talent lying deep within ourselves, some seed blueprint, simply waiting to be expressed when the climate is right. This is not how talent develops, just opening a packet and exposing the seed to the light. As described vividly but naively by the mother of one of the young Matildas, currently delighting audiences in the eponymous West End musical, I quote from an interview this mother gave in The Guardian last month, in which she uses the metaphor of talent as a literal gift. She said, people have talents and gifts, And the question is, do you keep them in a box or unwrap them? And do you unwrap them when they're younger or older? And we've chosen younger. I suggest that this justly proud mum has been too impressed by the homespun philosophies of Miss Honey, admittedly more attractive than the brutal Miss Trunchbull's, plausible, yet still false. Genes overlaid or unwrapped by the environment, G plus E, as I've indicated earlier, inadequately describes their intricate interplay, in which one can only be expressed in interaction with the other, and in which subtle differences in these interactions can multiply in both predictable and unpredictable directions. Any parent with 2 or more children knows that these siblings, ostensibly sharing the same environment, can be wildly dissimilar in temperament, preferences, behaviour, etc. It makes apparent sense, therefore, to attribute these differences to the other big independent variable and predictable fallback, and that is genes. The reality, though, is that these siblings have not shared the same environment since birth, except at the most superficial level. They've been shaped by countless subtle differences in their respective environments, acting in concert with their genes. For instance, the time and adult attention available to each child. Compare your firstborn's immaculate, triple-mounted, abundantly filled baby album with a sad symbol of neglect that passes for your secondborn's, or the immediate availability to the second-born child of a 24-hour playmate and the associated linguistic discourses that provides. Or perhaps the conscious and subconscious psychological scripts that each child is given to rehearse and perform by their parents. Scripts which may indeed have some small early foundation in reality, but which over time will be built upon and extended, and which quick judgments will declare to ourselves, to others, and most influentially to them. Our Claire is the sensitive artist, Miriam the verbal adventurer, and they read our scripts and feel moved to act them out. I'm suggesting, colleagues, that the familiar metaphors of talent development, plants being cultivated and nurtured, and gifts being unwrapped, are not too simple, for simple is desirable, but they are too simplistic, given our current knowledge. We would benefit from a new metaphor, one which better fits this current knowledge, but which retains the beauty of simplicity, one which can convert occasionally recondite subtleties into accessible understandings. And with this need in mind, I'd like to share with you now some insights offered by young people during the course of a piece of research I've been conducting with my friend and long-term collaborator and colleague, Deb Michelle, who I'm delighted is with us today. Deb and I have been working with around 90 Year 6 and 7 students in North Yorkshire, all of whom had applied directly by letter to be part of the study. These students already have emerging talents in the form of interests and passions in a wide range of areas considered of value in our culture: sport, dance, drama, creative writing, cinematography, maths, etc. And very few of which passions can be fully exercised, let alone fully realised within school alone. During our first contacts with them, we asked the students simply to draw what your learning looks like. We'd set up the activity via a stilling exercise and guided visualisation, and we provided them with basic materials and a conducive space. But other than inviting them to make free with metaphors and images of their own choosing, we'd left them to it. Subsequently, Deb and I attempted an interpretative phenomenological analysis of these drawings, using their own words and explanations where available, and looking for plausible themes and recurrent metaphors. Though positioned firmly in hermeneutics, we've stayed clear of the more fanciful interpretations that the field of visual semiotics might have seduced us into creating. We're aware, nonetheless, that our interpretations provide, at best, a very partial and tentative glimpse into a complex range of unique, lived experiences expressed visually and metaphorically. I will leave the methodological descriptions and detailed analysis to another forum, but I offer you the constructed categories with one exemplar from each, not always the most aesthetically pleasing example for each category, but one which captures well its nature. And these categories are presented in order of their numerical representation. the sense of. Fascinating as they are, perhaps we need to return to these young people in order to get a better insight into the meanings that they were creating. Though the children were working independently and in 3 geographically distinct cohorts, overwhelmingly represented is the metaphor of step-taking movement on a journey pregnant with perils, challenges, opportunities and choices, as in these representative examples presented now in a rapid dance of succession. There were plenty more, but I think you get the rough idea. These representations around talent development as unique manifestations of stepping offer us, I believe, the prospect of creating a metaphor that is better suited to the current state of scholarship in the field and which eludes the deterministic shackles and easy botanical assumptions of seed plus climate, G plus E. The skill of stepping is the primary element of any intent to project oneself forward in locomotion, to move with intent and with agency. And the form of stepping that is celebrated in all cultures as denoting its highest and most creative state is dance. To develop a talent, I propose, is analogous to the process of learning to walk and ultimately to dance, from the trials and failures of our first tentative and clumsy steps to the later joyous, fluid mix of secure skills, flow, and free expression. Once we have acquired the antecedent stepping skills, dance is accessible to everyone at its entry levels. We can all, with minimal effort and support, come to enjoy dance for its capacity to bring intrinsic pleasure and at all stages of our lives. I have a fond and vivid memory of my father-in-law's joyous participation at a caving held to celebrate his younger brother's and his sister-in-law's retirement a couple of years ago. The effects of his Alzheimer's syndrome were at that stage already quite profound, but the gusto with which he threw himself into a simple community circle dance, wild animal noises and all, revealed for those few joyous minutes the man he had always been, socially involved, at ease, spontaneous, puckish, and uninhibited. Dance is universal in our species, yet it has an infinite form, both between and within cultures. No child is born with a predisposition to dance in just one way or in just one style. He or she habituates to the prevailing traditions and orthodoxies of his or her culture. Dance is therefore both taught and expressed in many different ways, and its greatest exponents have always found ways to innovate, to interpret familiar routines uniquely, and to give these routines new meanings. And it's one of dance's greatest exponents, the dancer and choreographer Martha Graham, who describes so beautifully that obsessive compulsion that talent development demands of its disciples, the relentless intrinsic drive for continual improvement that fuels Erickson's deliberate practice. She called it simply divine dissatisfaction. For at its highest levels, dance and the development of all talents demands an astringent dedication, perfectionism, and discipline that to many of us can seem to border on self-abuse or masochism. Moderation in all things is good advice, except perhaps in the achievement of excellence. Could I invite you colleagues, friends, and family just to take another minute or two in reflection or discussion with someone new. Final interruption. Please bear with me. I'm very aware that refreshments beckon within 10 to 15 minutes. But I will still, hopefully, have a few opportunities just to invite people to make their thoughts wider known to the rest of us. But can I conclude, colleagues, with my final claim? And that's the notion that talent development is at once lawful and deeply anarchic. That which is most personal is also most general. This we were taught by the great therapist and founder of the tradition of client-centered therapy, Carl Rogers. As a callow 21-year-old postgrad student, I had the chance to meet and talk to Rogers when he visited South Africa on a speaking tour in 1982, just a few years before his death. With a few fellow students at the University of Port Elizabeth, as it was then called, we travelled some 7 hours to see him in Stellenbosch. The fact that this great man wished to listen with manifestly genuine interest and real connectedness to young adults like ourselves, who had in truth very little of any significance to say, gave life to his words. That which is most personal is also most general. Closer to home, I'm reminded of a similar thought expressed by the playwright Alan Bennett, who opened this very lecture theatre in 1993 as a tribute to his friend and founder of St Martin's College, Hugh Pollard. The best moments in reading, Bennett said, are when you come across something, a thought, a feeling, a way of looking at things, which you thought special and particular to you. And now here it is, set down by someone else, a person you've never met, someone even who is long dead. And it is as if a hand has come out and taken yours. Nowhere are Rogers and Bennett's sentiments more true than in the study of education. It's possible in 2012 to read the ideas of the great educators of Socrates, Comenius, Rousseau, Pestalozzi, Froebel, Newman, Dewey, Montessori, Steiner, Buber, Vygotsky, Frere, Bruno, Donaldson, Lippmann, Heathcote, most of these long dead, and to be struck by how often their thoughts collide with our own half-realized experiences and insights. It's these moments of personal connection that simultaneously give traction and longevity to the insights of the great educators and legitimacy to our own capacities for theory making. But an authentic legitimacy requires us to put the vast machineries that govern our lives to one side, however temporarily, and to reconnect with the idiosyncratic truths of our own unique lives, and to know that these have value. Yes, we are in many respects directed by the enabling and in some cases disabling structures of our professional lives, the TTA, HEFKI and its ref exercises, validation documents, the DES, Ofsted. And yes, we should probably have regard for the forms of social sciences research that still carry such weight in our society, couched as they usually are in the language and the constructs of positivism. Indeed, I have invoked a few of such studies myself during the course of this lecture. But in our attempts at securing compliance, convergence, and lawful and generalizable systems of operation, I ask, do we run the risk of losing the unique, lived, more anarchic experiences of the individual in all of this, and the deeper truths that these rich and personal narratives offer us? In our quest for statistical significance, do we sometimes forget that all experimental populations consist of groups of individuals, each with his or her unique constellation of values, beliefs, experiences, hopes, fears, and ambitions? It is this awareness that prompted me at the start of this lecture to profess a genuine ignorance in the field of talent development. This isn't a rhetorical device. It is, I believe, the only honest stance to take. Yes, we can learn much from laboratory studies and other traditional research models seeking lawful rules, as we would from the natural world. We can admire and respect the finest scholarship in this tradition, especially when robust and creative research design is combined with the valuing of qualitative evidence, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's work perhaps being preeminent here. But in the end, we must also find ways of valuing the unique lived experiences of and meanings created by individuals, if we are to buttress and in some cases challenge the established truths and dominant orthodoxies. No study in the hard or social sciences tradition that I've read has ever given us a new metaphor for understanding talent development. We must therefore look also to the forms of research that respect and give voice to people's unique stories, metaphors and meanings, and which foreground individual agency in medias res, in other words, in the middle of things. I'm speaking of traditions like hermeneutics, phenomenology, and interpretive inquiry, action research and living theory, visual semiotics and critical theory. I'm speaking in this instance of the careful and indeed the not so careful drawings of individual children, straining to express their experiences in visual form, of their words as they seek to capture their experiences of autotelic investment in an area of great interest and unknown outcomes, of the 10-year-old boy who summarised his own journey of talent development with the words, "Look back, but don't turn back." A reminder first to himself, and only incidentally to others, that reflection supports progression, not regression or surrender. I'm speaking of the mess and the loose ends and the uncertainties that this research must necessarily involve, since as educators we're seeking to understand ourselves in relation to other people, and there's nothing as complex and resistant to lawful predictability or generalizability as ourselves. When Bennett observes that briefing is terse, factual and to the point, reading is untidy, discursive and perpetually inviting, briefing closes down a subject, reading opens it up. Let us as educators substitute briefing for training and reading for education. The new claim now reads, training is terse, factual and to the point. Education is untidy, discursive and perpetually inviting. Training closes down a subject. Education opens it up. Let us recognise when we see education in these broad terms that the development of talent is merely a cipher for all education. We have ultimately to move on from the easy 70s of G+E and embrace instead the much messier improvised choreographies that can allow us all truly to dance. Thank you very much.